So what I'm hearing is that like things were going great and black trans women were winning trans civil rights for us, and then trans men and detransitioners wrecked everything. I will be taking your formal apologies on air now. Hello, everyone. I'm Talia Bhatt, your incredibly tired radical trans feminist.
Hi, I'm Emma Zakharuk. Moderately tired, detrans movement and radical feminist.
And today we're bringing you the first episode of our second season, the season premiere, so to speak, where we will be discussing the history of the so-called third wave of feminism, where this is going to sort of be like a theme of our entire second season. We're going to sort of like take a closer look at the movement itself, because the second wave of feminism sort of came to an end when Andrea Dworkin was sealed in a prison of stone at the end of the 80s, and Judith Butler destroyed all transphobia and lesbophobia in feminism by inventing queer theory.
God, I wish.
And this was followed by a renaissance, where a diversity of viewpoints that had been heretofore marginalized in feminism were finally permitted to come to the fore and solve patriarchy forever. My turn to say I fucking wish.
Until
You know,
2024 or 5 kind of deal.
Yeah. Or so the story goes.
Somehow
So-
Palpatine has returned.
So here at Cracked Ivory, we are going to examine this narrative, sort of look at this overall picture and do a bit of a deeper dive into feminist history past the second wave, which at this point has been a topic that we have dissected and discussed to death, and that everyone who is aware of feminist currents in any way, a lot of people always talk about the second wave, whether as, this is where it all went wrong, or this is where it started, or like, this is where it began and we built on. But not as many people focus on the third wave as such. They're not usually able to agree on what constitutes the third wave, but no one ever quite looks at its flaws or shortcomings, which is quite important because we're here in the, like Emma said, in the big 2020s, in the second half of the 2020s even, and we have what the utter repudiation of Me Too, the modern male grievance movement, sweeping anti-feminism, global anti-trans panic. We're dealing with such fun goodies that, feminism was supposed to solve. So what went wrong, everyone? So we're going to start not at the beginning, but at the end, because we're going to start with something called the trans tipping point, as it was coined in the mid-2010s, at this moment of like peak optimism and hope on the heels of this big wave of gay civil rights victories and legalization of gay marriage across most of the West. And to that end, our guest today is someone who's been on the pod before. Would you like to introduce yourself again, Isaac?
Yeah, hi. My name is Isaac. I believe last time I was on here, I was introduced as like a Tom Ripley impersonator or something. Maybe that's a different place.
No,
the
it's
token
here, yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm the token white man friend, I suppose. I'll put it that way. But I write about trans men a lot. That's kind of like my topic is writing about trans men and how we fit into the broader trans movement and why we should stop being annoying online. So
Thank you. We very much appreciate that. Isaac yelling at trans men to stop being annoying online is sponsored by Cracked Ivory. So Isaac, what exactly is the trans tipping point? I'm gonna treat you as the expert on this for the sake of this episode for whatever reason, probably because you wrote an article on it.
Yeah, so the trans tipping point comes from a Time magazine cover. This Time magazine cover came out in June of 2014, and it had Laverne Cox on the cover.
Wait, what's 24?
Yeah, it was 2014. Yeah, it's a Laverne Cox is on the cover. She was part of Orange is the New Black at the time, and it was basically this article just saying like, "Wow, trans people are getting a lot of rights recently, and now we have a black trans woman on TV. Wow, we've hit the trans tipping point." So the kind of view here was like, we have reached the next frontier of human rights. We are here in the future. Awesome, like where things are going great, and trans people just have the whole world ahead of them. We're so lucky. We're so great in 2014. And that didn't last very long.
Yeah.
No, and I will also point out that, like, where were you during the trans tipping point? Because where I was, it was not going so great for trans people. Now, I will say that, like, because the world is fairly globalized and oriented towards the Anglosphere in some ways, definitely in the social justice ways, seeing great progress in a Western nation is not necessarily without impact on others, because
Mhm.
if nothing else, it gives hope, it gives precedent, and it does spark conversations even in much more queerphobic countries. So it does kind of suck to see the supposed vanguard of social justice movements, complicated as that is, to regress.
Yeah, it is. It is more nuanced than just, the rest of the world follows the West's lead. But like, unfortunately, you do kind of have to admit that the West is a global cultural hegemon. That
Yeah.
is just kind of how it is. It sets the tone. It has a lot of the discussions, and those discussions and tactics and historical lessons, if any, maybe gleaned, all trickle down. Like the 1960s Black Civil Rights Movement definitely had impact on like freedom and liberation and anti-colonial movements all over the world, including places like India. And that remains true for cultural currents to this very day. All the way to the 2000s for both progressive and reactionary currents.
Yeah, and
I
I will
fear.
say that reactionary currents are more effective at downstreaming because they usually embolden the conservatives who don't usually need help. And
Mhm.
usually they are quite often bolstered by the elite, by the richer peoples that have more money to, enforce their will. So if like the trans tipping point indicated a slow push upwards in the trajectory of trans rights elsewhere, then
Mhm.
the deterioration and the anti-trans tipping point represents a much faster push towards the opposite.
And I also just want to
Yeah.
add, like, if I can be like a little Marxist about it, it's like when we talk
Yep.
about like the West, like leading social justice or whatever, it's like, well, it's because the United States is a very developed country, and a lot of progress
Yep.
happens with like economic and technological development. So it's not that like the global South are so backwards; they're just evil people who are so backwards. It's like, yeah, like, well, the like America, U.S. went in, and like in Europe went in, and we're like, you can't develop the way y'all should.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because, like, okay, it's very hard and very annoying to try to strike this balance of like, because, okay, Westerners just seem really bad at and sometimes flat out incapable of nuance. Like,
Yeah.
when I enter into these conversations, sometimes it truly feels like what I am being told by Western interlocutors is that we only have two settings. Either we can think of the global South as completely backwards and regressive and inherently evil and less civilized and less capable of making progress in terms of like granting rights to women and queer people than the West, or we must think of the global South as as the quintessential noble savages whose more spiritual and more connected to nature and more primitive cultures were overwritten by Western hegemony, and the West introduced everything evil to the egalitarian and forward thinking cultures of the global South. And it's just like, well, dialectics, baby. The truth is somewhere between those two extremes, as hopefully should be obvious to anyone who thinks about it for a little bit or actually has direct experience with global South cultures, whether being there or interacting with people from there. But let me ask you, Isaac. We were in 2014. Gay marriage was the legal, marrying women, anarchy, all of that good stuff happening. Black trans women on TV. Perfect. The fall of the West is imminent.
Yeah.
What went wrong?
Hi, yeah, what went wrong? That's why I still am working on my big project on the anti-trans tipping point, because I'm trying to figure out what went wrong and how we can stop it from going even wronger, if you will. It was obviously like a multi-year decline. So the trans tipping point was 2014. I went through and I looked at a bunch of trans policies, and basically 2019 is what I'm calling like the peak of the trans rights movement, right? Like that was really the peak. It was like the peak in the sense of that was the year that like the most pro-trans stuff went into place. So I made this big
Sure.
chart where I was like charting out all the different policies in all 50 states. In 2019, like something changed and it went. And my guess, this is my guess. I shouldn't my guess. My hypothesis, I suppose, is. So 2014 happens, and what was going on in 2014 outside of like, same-sex marriage about to become legal in all 50 states, Laverne Cox, all that. What was also happening was the Obama administration was making some changes in the federal government that were pro-trans changes, right? So they weren't like laws being passed. It was just like, oh, we have this new policy now where federal employee benefits have to, give you like trans health care. They have to cover that or whatever. So he's like implementing changes like that. And then in 2019, again, my kind of hypothesis here's what happened is that you had Trump get elected in 2016, so you had Republicans kind of controlling things, and then midterms hit in 2018, and then look at this. We now have kind of more like a blue wave, not totally, but like more Democrats coming in, and I think trans rights at that point were. I'm being very careful here. I'm not saying Democrats are the champions of trans rights, but I think at the time, because like early talk, I kind of like a thing about trans rights become like a free speech issue than something else. I think it's kind of how they approached it. It was like trans rights and the way they kind of conceptualized it was like an easy win in the way we're talking to like the average bleeding heart liberal who thinks people should be able to do whatever they want. You had 2019 happen. You had all these pro-trans policies go into place all around the country, mostly in like the same kind of few states like out west in like California or up in the Northeast, but you had some other places too. And then 2021 hits, and that is the anti-trans tipping point. And 2021 is, of course, the first year Biden was president, so I do think it started as a backlash to that. But then, other forces came into play, so it's not purely like a partisan issue that is part of it, but then you also had, like COVID happens in 2020. You have increasing economic anxieties happening. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that right now in the United States, trans rights are probably like approaching an all-time low right now, and also the economy is precarious. It's terrible. We're all suffering. So it's just like a big conglomeration of factors. But mostly, I think it came down to like trans people are an easy scapegoat. Democrats were not actually that committed to the project of trans rights because, again, their approaches were like bourgeois free speech. We need T-girl bosses as well, and not like, how can we help protect trans healthcare for trans people? They didn't really campaign for that, and now you see trans healthcare being ripped away from us, and they don't really care that much about it because it's like, well, you could just go to a doctor and pay out of pocket, or private insurances still cover it, but it's like, well, private insurances cost $600 a month, or at best. So that's kind of where it went wrong, I think.
Yep. And okay, let's also rewind a little bit. So I think I will just like mention Me Too without going too much into detail over here because like I believe the peak of like Me Too discourse, like the backlash to it, by the way, it happened like way quicker than people imagine or remember. Like Me Too has gone too far was a talking point approximately a day after the Me Too discourse started up.
I remember it being almost immediate.
Pretty much, yeah. And that was also kind of at its peak at roughly the same time, like right on the heels of Biden's election, I believe. But even discounting all of that, even discounting the sort of like cultural forces and the cultural organization of anti-feminism and male grievance politics, that like positive trans representation, like as you touched upon, Isaac, the whole like feel good narrative of like the trans people finally are going to get their turn, their seat at the table, their chance to enshrine their whole civil rights. Part of the thing is that okay, in terms of like the sort of role that trans rights played in progressive politics at the time, I think it was on vogue to say that he supported trans rights, to repeat a couple of like easy pithy slogans, trans women are women, blah blah blah. But like there was not much substantive understanding of what trans rights actually entail and what trans people actually need, and also crucially, what discrimination and bigotry against trans people actually looks like. Because it is, in some sense, it's simple. I could rattle off a definition for you in like 30 seconds, but that's because I spent like a good long time actually studying this stuff and writing it down, right? In like the thick of 2020, peak liberal feminism and all that, feminists even were not particularly well positioned to combat the idea of the immutability of sex being, one of the foundations of patriarchy. even though like that was like the idea that the oppression of women is not biological, is social, and not rooted in some kind of essential sexed truth was like Radfem 101, right? But the journey to the mid 2010s feminism kind of took a beating. It kind of became less about consciousness raising and organization and activism and studying and taking it seriously as a discipline and more about like lifestyle, personal aesthetics, personal choices. Here is your feminism Bible printed in Cosmo, and if you follow these 15 feminist steps, this is how you will live a feminist life. And in that kind of like sort of environment where like feminism has kind of gone mainstream but has effectively just become a branding tool for capitalist culture, like you're not going to get a lot of people who understand exactly what transphobia and transmisogyny look like, how they manifest, and how it actually affects the lives of everyday trans people. People aren't going to understand or like really think deeply about why we, really need access to healthcare and we need it to be accessible and affordable because especially in the sort of like celebrity, like glamour dappled image of like the public trans women that sort of came to the fore in the 2010s. The whole idea of like, oh god, I've said this before rather brusquely, and it is a very uncharitable thing to say about our allies and such. But like on a really core level, people did not conceptualize trans people as people who change their sex.
Yes.
People conceptualize trans people as super gay people, as very flamboyant people, as cross dressers and drag queens. And like you could, through a certain perspective and through a certain lens, put us all into a sort of continuous singular transgender umbrella. And we did for political reasons. But this like idea that like sex isn't immutable, sex can change, and we do change sex. We kind of lost sight of that, and we kind of lost sight of why ensuring our access to the means and the ability to change sex is like vital for trans liberation, and if I can be so bold, vital for bodily autonomy, vital for a feminist future as we are learning these days.
Yeah, and I will also say that, to my mind, there were two key issues with the way trans healthcare was talked about and the way trans people were talked about in the broader context. I'll start with the second one. In my opinion, there has always been, before the trans tipping point, and not much after it, there has always been very little focus on trans people that have transitioned, period. Yes. And in order to understand transphobia, to really understand it, you need to be able to make this link to like how trans women are like infertile second-class cis women, how trans men are like, queer cis men tarnished by femininity. If you don't understand that, you don't really understand that sex change is possible and how trans people actually fit into society. But if you only ever fixate on stories of coming out, of pre-transition stories, on early transition stories, then all you see is trans people as a kind of spectacle of change, but the change never comes to anything. But like the point is that you never understand what it entails. You don't understand the realities of trans people that do these things. It's just kind of a novelty. And then coupled with that is there was a lot of talk that's kind of like, it emerged from an earlier era of transition as a necessity to reduce harm. It's technically true that that's what it is for a lot of people. It is something they really need to reduce harm because they feel like shit without it. And their quality of lives is much, much lower for a variety of reasons, from mental health to dangers just going outside the street. In talking about it as something that we should be allowed to do, pretty please, because otherwise we'll suffer greatly. Given that it's something that patriarchal societies don't want to do, they do not want you to change your predestination, it creates motivation to be like, okay, we will test you for how much you need it, for how badly you will suffer without it. And we will grant it to you on the basis of that. And if we do a study where we conclude that actually your suicide rates don't drop after you transition or whatever, or don't sufficiently drop, we're like, well, is it really the best way to fix your depression?
Right. Because it gives an opening, right? If we say that, like, you don't understand, gender dysphoria is a disease and transition is the only cure. Well, transition is something that cishet society, that heterosexual society absolutely abhors. And it can sort of exploit that opening to push the idea to, if you make that sort of like the basis for trans liberation, it can very easily invalidate the idea or put forth, say, propaganda, science with a shaky foundation that is still nonetheless adopted into legislation about how transition is actually not that good, how it is experimental and modern and risky, and it doesn't actually result in good outcomes. And you know what might result in good outcomes? Taking these crazy people and giving them therapy to be happy in their bodies, because how can we allow people to mutilate themselves just because they have a mental illness?
One, there's a very obvious link between reproductive rights and bodily autonomy and women's rights, right? The verbiage is extremely reminiscent of, like, for example, having to go through a therapist appointment before you're allowed to get an abortion, for example, or arbitrary waiting periods for abortion and sterilization. And the other thing that came up off the back of the trans tipping point into the anti-trans tipping point is the conversation about rapid onset gender dysphoria, focus on trans men as mutilated little girls, and the sort of the ultimate chink in the armor of the argument, like, transition is something that we super duper need or else we'll kill ourselves, please let us not kill ourselves, is the
We didn't watch our disability justice flank. We should
No,
have
no, we didn't.
read more disability justice.
The ultimate fault that the right has found and exploited very successfully is the concept of a detransitioner, because not to get into the whole thing, I'm sure Isaac will have some things to say about Rogd and stuff like that. But if transition is something someone really, really needs and can't absolutely live without, how come there are people who have transitioned and then we're like, nah? And so here we are.
So what I'm hearing is that, like, things were going great and Black trans women were winning trans civil rights for us, and then trans men and detransitioners wrecked everything. I will be taking your formal apologies on air now.
Well, actually, yeah, I have a few things like I want to build upon here. So, firstly, to your point about detransitioners being, like, kind of hijacked by the right wing. So back in 2025, when Kansas was about to make trans healthcare for minors illegal, I went to the initial hearings on one of the bills, or I guess technically it's both bills, I should say. So I went to both of the hearings, and there was a mom there who had a trans son who died by suicide. And it was because he was 18, he was in rural Kansas, and, he just was experiencing so much transphobia and he couldn't get healthcare, and so he killed himself. So Christy, that's her name, Christy gives this testimony, talks about her son. It's so heart-wrenching. And then Chloe Cole, who again is not from Kansas, she gets paid $200,000 a year, get flown around from state to state to push for anti-trans bills. Chloe Cole gets up and calls Christy emotionally manipulative because she talked about her son who killed himself. Like, it was one of the most ghoulish things I had ever seen. Like, I was like,
if you've ever heard what Chloe Cole says about herself and her detransition, I would describe that as pretty emotionally manipulative.
Yeah.
Like, as an aside, I mentioned that I'm detrans at the beginning of the podcast. If you've never tuned into anything before, it really, really sucks that only the right has the talking stick on detransition.
I agree.
Because it creates the effect that, here's the thing, they lie about most things, including detransition, but because only they talk about it, the few things that they say that resemble the truth or include words that are true, that are representative of the detrans experience, have an indelible association with transphobia. So even when you say things like, I am detrans, or I stopped taking tea, or not a big fan of my top surgery, or whatever, people autocomplete in their minds, this means we should ban transition forever. You don't even have to say anything. That's why you kind of have to, if you're detrans, to always caveat yourself when you speak. But that is really bad for like a rights battle and access to healthcare. There is push now to change that, in part by me, but by a lot of other people also. By a lot of other people also, like, publishing research that has collated a bunch of previous research and concludes pretty definitively that the current transition measures that withhold transition lead to poor outcomes for people who detransition. For detransitioners, be it for whatever reason they detransition, but mostly focusing on people who do so voluntarily. So it's a very uphill struggle.
Yeah, and there's always been a big knowledge gap over here, right? Because this particular truth about how much trans people struggle with an antagonistic medical industry was nowhere in the conversation,
Yep.
as far as I
And
remember.
to kind of go back to an earlier point too, I had like bouncing in
Yeah.
my head for a few minutes.
Mhm.
So I think, going back, because Emma, you earlier talking about like the spectacle of transition, and I think
Yeah.
like the right wing detransition narrative kind of provides like an ending to the transition spectacle. Like it ends
Yeah.
in
It's
tragedy.
also a spectacle.
And
It's like the
so
anti-spectacle
right,
sort
it's the
of thing.
anti-spectacle, yeah, and so I
Yeah.
think, like, this focus on the spectacle has had really bad impacts on trans people in 2 ways, like, I think about trans men, trans women. So, like, I think, like, the
Mhm.
spectacle of transition has led to the birthday boyism of trans men online, right? Because
Mm.
a lot of, like, trans men I beef with or whatever, like, cannot conceptualize
Mhm.
themselves past that spectacle, right? Like, I
Yeah.
wrote a whole thing
Mhm.
recently about trans men and sexual violence, and there was a lot I said in that article, but one of the things I was focused on was this idea that trans men who experience violence experience it because they're like early or pre-transition and there's nothing past transition, which bothered me, and that's why I wrote like a whole thing. So it has this kind of weird effect where it's like trans men especially seem to now view themselves as like we are ontologically female, we can't ever go past like the spectacle of transition.
Mhm.
And then on the other side of things, like with trans women, the reason why I was motivated to write my anti-trans tipping point series is I was thinking about the trans tipping point, how Laverne Cox was on the cover for playing a black trans woman in a women's prison. And then one of the very first
Mhm.
things Trump did in his second term was pass an executive order that forces all federal trans prisoners to go to the prison of their assigned sex at birth and detransition them. And this bothered me because if you look at the data, like 1 in 2 black people have been incarcerated, trans black people, I should say, sorry, have been incarcerated at some point in their lives. And trans women experience incarceration more frequently, but black trans women are like the most frequently imprisoned.
Mhm.
So it's like the irony. It's like we were celebrating Laverne Cox for playing this black trans woman in a women's prison, and now black trans women are being put in male prisons and having their estrogen taken away from them. And like liberals are like just like, quiet on this, like they're quiet. What about the trans tipping point? We were so like yay. But because we never actually conceptualized trans women as human beings with specific needs, instead we're thinking of them as like a character on a TV show I like that's
Mhm.
that again, there's
Mhm.
the spectacle of transition. We did it again. It's a spectacle. We don't actually view the actual black trans women as real people who need our help, but rather a character in a TV show I like. So that's.
Excellent. Yeah. Awesome. I think I could tie all this up neatly. So what we're basically talking about, why exactly did we neglect our disability justice flank? Why exactly was liberalism and liberal feminism caught flat-footed, even as it was poised to, we were already passing pro-trans legislation. We were already experiencing a bit of a cultural shift. Effectively, we've always been suffering a kind of information imbalance, epistemic injustice, if you will, Talia, say the line. And while there was increasing visibility of trans people in, even if just in Western Anglophonic culture, but really worldwide, there was not as much familiarity or as much visibility or as much light shown on our struggles, on how difficult it is for us to access vital, life saving healthcare, on how much that healthcare actually is life saving, and also on how much that healthcare even does. Like, this is a very basic thing, but like most cis people, if asked, would not be able to tell you that trans women grow breasts.
Mhm.
If cis people see trans women with breasts, even now, a vast, vast majority of them would believe that like we got
Mhm.
implants. The idea that like the hormones trans women take are the same hormones that cis women have, that is not a thing that has percolated cultural consciousness at all.
Not even a little. I have an anecdote about this. I
Mhm.
have a transphobic mother, and at one point she visited me in an apartment I flat shared with a trans woman. And, obviously I warned my roommate, don't worry, no hate crimes occurred. And they basically
Mhm.
didn't speak to each other at all. But
Mhm.
basically, she came in the morning, and my roommate was taking a shower, and she saw her briefly as she walked from the shower to her room. Once the door closed, she immediately turned to me and talked like, why do these people have to wear so much makeup? Do they think that women are just makeup, etc., etc.? She was wearing zero makeup. She just came out of the shower. The
Mhm.
only reason she said that is because she looked like a woman. She was an estrogen. So to her, the idea that a trans woman would look like a woman was inconceivable. It had to have been cakes and cakes of makeup on her face that did not exist.
And there's been like zero pushback on that, right?
It also
Yep.
just like because you're talking about like how cis people don't know that trans women can grow breasts. Like in general,
Yeah.
cis people know shit about endocrinology because even cis men can grow breasts. Like if their estrogen levels are jacked, they can do it. You know, like.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to know this because they don't know anything, and then they want to talk about us not understanding biological reality. And it's like, babe, I don't know like that much about biology, and generally speaking, but I sure know way more than you do. I promise you. Like just being a trans person, I know way more than you do.
And this persistent idea sort of serves to like anchor trans people in the realm of the cosmetic, right?
Yeah.
Which is why we are most often conceptualized as super gay people. We are super gay people who have gender fucked too close to the sun. But like effectively, what we're doing is we're using wigs and makeups and haircuts and clothes in order to like approach like a facsimile or like a simulacrum
Yes.
of the other gender, but without ever quite getting there is the popular cis idea.
It's a slightly conflicting framing, right? Because on the one hand, what defense of trans healthcare there is, it's like always preventing like suicide, basically, right? To abridge it. And on the other hand, it's like, well, it's just, free speech, freedom of free speech. And so what it results in is that basically trans healthcare and hormones are talked about like antidepressants, sort of. They are mood relieving substances, basically.
And I guess like kind of related to that too, because obviously there has been this idea of like hormones don't actually do anything to you, like the whole like we can always tell you'll never be a woman. But what I've also seen recently too, as trans men have gotten more attention, is there's sort of this weird irony here where now they're like, actually, we can't let you do it because it changes you too much. And so I've talked about this too online, but I have this one friend in Kansas. He lives out in rural Kansas. He's a trans man. He passes completely as male. He has a big beard. He's a big guy. He comes off as a bear because he's also faggy. He's married to a man. In Kansas, they just passed a law this year that basically mandates that trans people have to use the bathroom if they're assigned sex at birth. And so my friend has been engaging in like malicious compliance. So he wears a shirt that says like I have a vagina. Yeah, he does. He's just like, yeah, fine, like I'll do it. And what I've noticed with him, it's very interesting, is like he gets a lot of like death threats and threats of violence for like being in women's spaces, even though he's supposed to be. But at the same time, men who it's like always men who are like, you look like a woman, you'll always be a woman, right? And it's like, is it so powerful that you have to take the testosterone away from us and you have to threaten us when we're in women's spaces, or is it so not powerful that you can tell that we're women? It's just like normal emasculation, right? Like cis men call each other women, but it's still like interesting.
It's basically the basis of the whole like sex is immutable, it's predestined, it can never ever change. Trying to wrestle with the reality that sex actually isn't, one, it's changeable, two, humans are not as sexually dimorphous as is advertised by our cultures. And a lot of the dimorphic features are emphasized by fashion, mannerism, and social custom. So what people do to reconcile these things is they say that you will always be a woman, / you will always be a man. You can never change your sex, but you can only mutilate it. So they basically take it to the conclusion that you will be a ruined woman or a ruined man, but you will never be the other option, basically.
If you just talk to us for 5 minutes, you can get a better picture of what trans life is like than if you paid attention to all of the fear-mongering transphobic articles in the New York Times and the UK press. But most people aren't going to do that. And here's where fucking Harry Potter finally comes in. I think this is best exemplified and typified by the story of J.K. Rowling's public image. Because here's the thing, folks. During the time of peak trans tipping point, there were already rumblings and rumors and fears that dear progressive darling, jowling, howling, rowling, was in fact a TERF. Some of the evidence was that she is British and rich, and if I'm going to be totally honest with you, that is damning enough for a lot of people. But like, if you are a tranny, and if you are especially a trans woman who is familiar with the culture of gender conservatives, with the culture of the people who call themselves TERFs online and who fixate on trans women on social media, who create this online panopticon where they like will screenshot random trans women just having a bad day or just like being on social media and like post them in group chats and in forums to jeer at and mock and direct harassment towards those vulnerable people. if you're familiar with this culture, and if you're familiar with the language they use and the talking points they employ, especially their onboarding, on-ramping talking points that they used to roll out in order to not appear as extreme as they actually were, then you could tell that something was up with J.K. Rowling and her relationship to trans women and trans people. So this is kind of like a mini version of everything else that happened, right? Trans people tried to talk about the fact that the author of the beloved Harry Potter books, the massive cultural touchstone, was in fact transphobic, and not just transphobic, not even in a kind of like, says the occasional like ignorant way, not transphobic in some kind of like, incidental banal way, but like actively extremist because she's getting her language and her ideas of trans people from a very particular place, which is the radicalization chamber that is conservative and right-wing mothers online from the UK. So by the time that J.K. Rowling made it clear herself in her own words how transphobic and extremist she was, just how much her views tended towards conspiracizing, tended towards assuming and branding all trans women as rapists and criminals, it was already far past the point where recognizing that, I mean, like, I suppose it wouldn't have done anything if we had recognized it a couple of years earlier as well. But the unwillingness of the wider culture of cishet society to even accept that J.K. Rowling was transphobic before she came out and just said it herself, before she came out and declared war on the trannies by her damn self. That tells a story, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think throughout the trans tipping point, it never really registered. I don't think that trans people are, if we're talking about the movement of feminism, it never really registered that the way trans people are is very key to understanding the feminist struggle in general.
Yes.
Trans people were an addendum to feminism. Like, we should involve trans people in feminism. We should include trans people in feminism. Trans people are not possible to exclude with feminism. You can do feminism poorly, and that would be by excluding trans people. But you can't do
But yeah,
actual feminism without considering them.
yet the mood at the time was just like, oh, hey, these trans people have just shown up to this conversation. We just invented them in 2014.
Yeah.
Shall we let them into the club?
Well, because you're saying this, like, season's gonna be talking about like the failures of third wave feminism, which I think extremely, like, we need to extremely have a conversation about that. And I think the anti-trans movement is really like a great, unfortunately, like a great example of how much it failed, because the third wave movement, I think one of the big problems is that third wave is so individualist, capitalist, idealist brained. Like, you kind of came down to like, I want to be part of the system. Like, I am who I say I am. I define what I want, and I want to succeed in the existing system without ever taking into account like what actually what does it actually mean to be a woman? And like trans people actually have an answer to that, which is why, like, I'll be honest about this. I got really kind of like blackpilled about feminism because of how much transphobia there was until I found transfeminism, and I was like, here it is, it making sense, because I got so caught up in looking at like transphobic rad films, basically, or maybe cult films more accurately, and just lib films who don't know shit about anything. Transfeminism provided like an actual material analysis, like there are like economic factors at play that create this idea of gender, and we fit into these economic systems X, Y, and Z ways. But the lib films, they don't talk about that. It's like choice feminism. It's I define what it is to be a woman. It's Taylor Swift writing cat eye sharp enough to kill a man or whatever. So and it's like that's what feminism is in the third wave, unfortunately, and that really led to the backlash of trans people.
Yeah, it's like a third wave insofar as it existed and did things, right? Well, things were done, but composing feminisms into waves is a very post factum kind of thing, But insofar as it existed, it was a response to the second wave. And when it pertains to trans people, and like, I want to be clear that a lot of the backlash to the second wave, as you have made clear in your essays, Talia, was about the feminism, not the fact that they were transphobic. But from trans people, obviously, the backlash was, you are transphobic. That's completely understandable. What has happened in reaction to that, because second wave feminism, radical feminism, was quite concerned with social constructivism and examining what it really means to be a man or a woman and what we can do with that, right? The backlash overall, as it usually happens, stepped back to a more secure conservative position. which is let's not question that.
Mhm.
And that was common
Yeah.
among trans people too. It was reverting to a biological / divine predestination. I'm a
Mhm.
man or a woman because there is an essence within me that declares it so.
Yeah.
And man and woman are therefore categories that can't really be changed. We can talk about how women don't deserve to be treated poorly or whatever. But the concept of what a woman is something enshrined within my soul or my brain or something to that effect.
And okay, so we're obviously going to explore this in greater detail over the rest of this season. So the reason for that is that the third wave is actually it really was never a unified thing from jump.
Mhm.
It was actually it was at minimum two different things that sort of started to happen at the same time. And even while I'm acknowledging that, I am still narrativizing and being reductive, but you kind of have to do in order to be concise, so bear with me. The thing about the third wave, if we want to call it that, is that it is the story of two things. It is the story of a sort of triumph of a kind of legal feminism.
Mhm.
The idea that like the approach to feminism should be legalist first, and that was the sort of like best and most direct avenue through which to secure the strongest, most material gains. And in some ways, that was not a repudiation of the second wave, but that was a continuation of some strains and some core principles, some core tenets of the second wave. Catherine McKinnon's work on sexual harassment, anti-discrimination law, Kimberly Crenshaw, and intersectionality itself. These all, which is obviously very, very core to understanding the story of the third wave.
Mhm.
These all emerged from a legal feminist framework. And the thing about the legal feminist framework is that it's great and it's impactful, but the ability of it to trickle down into more accessible formats, that becomes limited. Before the quote unquote third wave, feminism was more of a grassroots activism sort of thing. It was more about protests, about demonstrations, about organizing. And all of those were done with the ultimate goal of achieving some legal outcomes, right? At least in the short term. Even if there were people with these grand visions whose ultimate goal was the overhauling of all patriarchal institutions. At least in the short term, we were all able to agree, from moderate to extremist, that better legal outcomes are good,
Mhm.
however you want to define those. But then there's also the second story, the other side of the third wave. It really is very like Crenshaw on one side, Butler on the other, because the other side of the story of the third wave is the story of how queer liberation and trans liberation, as envisioned as an extension of queer liberation, broke up with feminism, more or less.
You made the kind of cheeky remark earlier about like second wave feminism dying when Andrew Dworkin died and then Judith Butler coming in. But it's like, another interesting thing timing wise, and I keep coming back to this, is 90s is the neoliberal era, right? Or 80s, 90s neoliberalism. And I don't think that's a coinky dink because, you had like in the US, this like privatize things, move them out of the country, whatever, like whatever generates like profit. And so I think you see this like weird, very individualist sort of shift in a lot of thinking just in general. Feminism, definitely a lot of queer politics, definitely. Like, I mean, even like the rise of like the self-help guru, like was in the 90s, and I don't think it's a coincidence with like the prosperity gospel and all that, essentially. So where it got to trans people, it became very like trans rights is about just being yourself, performing gender however you want to perform it, and that's fine. And we're doing pronoun circles.
To be
Yeah,
clear,
yeah.
this was like to an extent. Sorry. To an extent of flattening of it, there were and have been third wave feminists that are concerned with legal struggles and right about their own
Sorry, I
struggles and
shouldn't.
stuff like that. But
I was
this
being
is
overly
like the
reductive.
general.
Yeah, I was being reductive, but
But this is what has pushed into the mainstream and to what their work condenses once it reaches the mainstream. Because always when something reaches the mainstream, it condenses to its least offensive. Incarnation.
To be clear, I'm not against like the legal framework either. I understand the necessity. Like as a trans person, I want legal protections. But it's kind of like the same-sex marriage debacle where it's like like that's fine, but then like once the bourgeois gays got married, like okay, we're done with the rest of you. Goodbye, we're out of here. And that was that,
So like as you said, Talia is the big divorce with feminism. Ties a bit. It's actually ties quite directly to what I was talking about with complete, uncontested, unchallenged co-optation of the detransition narrative, because it's mainly focused on detrans women, not detrans men, for reasons that can be easily intuited. It's Obviously not as bad because there's a lot more women than there are and or ever will be detransitioners, right?
Mhm.
It's not possible to just avoid talking about women altogether, as it can be with detrans people. But the fact remains that when queerness in the political view and its own organizing decides to be like, we're not about feminism anymore, that's basically making it so talking about women's issues is the business of
Mhm.
TERFs and eventually GCs, which and it's a radicalization pipeline, to be quite frank, which obviously we can see
Mhm.
now conclude into complete abandonment of women, and even multiple articles by reactionary women being like, "I was abandoned, huh?" Like, but everyone saw it coming. Well, okay, not everyone, but a lot of people saw it coming. But like, um,
Mhm.
much as you can be smug about it, like, oh, you thought the MAGA crowd is gonna accept you, like, yeah, sure, smugness is warranted there, I feel, at least by some people.
Mhm.
But the fact of the matter remains that we did kind of act like feminism was over. We
Yeah.
did kind of act as if saying things like women get disproportionately sexually assaulted by men was a little bit turfy thing to say.
And I guess that's why, like, I didn't exactly articulate like that, but like part of the
Yeah.
underlying reason why I wrote my thing recently about sexual violence and how we talk about
Yeah.
it, because I think there is a way in which like some of the anti-trans backlash comes from an actually an understandable place, if that makes sense. Like, I understand why women
Mhm.
continue to be afraid of like men, but it's done in a way that then ironically sequesters and polices women further instead of actually saying like
Mhm.
let's find a liberatory route. So it's like you had like the feminist, and then you had the crowd that would be a feminist kind of abandon it, like the divorce, as Talia put it. And then you have all these women who are frustrated, they're not getting their questions answered, they don't want to go, and so a lot of them just end up going back to reactionary land, and like, this is good when
Mhm.
men attack trans women, that's good for me, except it's not, because who's gonna not accuse you of that? Like, I've seen cis women online recently who pass perfectly well, not even pass, like, I'm saying, like, they look perfectly feminine, they've had kids or whatever, and they're still getting called trans women, right? So it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, congrats, you went back to the reactionary route, but also I will say that I feel like that's a failure on our part as like the left team, and maybe I'm more culpable as the American in the chat right now, but like the American left is so just like idealist brain rot. Like, we're not actually talking about reality. We're not actually talking about like the similarities we have between us. Like, part of the reason why I push against birthday
Mhm.
boyism is because like I'm not trying to say like men experience violence more than women. And I'm an MRA guy, but it's like men also experience a lot of violence. So you can't say I experience violence, therefore I'm a woman. Like, no, men also experience violence. And actually, to stop patriarchal violence, we need to talk about that, because violence is part of patriarchy, and men being violent and experiencing violence is part of patriarchy. So,
I have been unfortunately brought to a point where I am gonna have to fucking talk about men in order to sort of like complete the full picture when it comes to
yeah.
understanding the oppression of trans people,
Mhm.
trans women, and even cis women. But we'll get to that eventually. We will talk about violence as a patriarchal gender policing mechanism sooner or later. For now, let's tie all of these threads together. So in some sense, you can sort of understand this shift in a kind of organic way, right? Most liberation movements sort of start at the grassroots, and then as they gain more momentum, more visibility, and more legitimacy, usually due to the support of the more affluent, of the more educated, of the quote unquote more elite, it starts to shift. The question of like who owns the movement, who is the face of the movement,
Mhm.
who are the leaders of the movement, who speaks for the movement, they slowly start to shift from those who are most embattled and embittered, and towards those who have the most ability and the most resources and the most breathing room because of this or that privilege. The most ability to actually talk about it. Unfortunately, we live in a world where you do need a skosh of privilege to be able to do shit like this
Yeah.
for a living, you know?
Yeah.
So the thing about the transition, quote unquote, of the second of the second wave to the third wave is that this legalization, this academization, this legal feminist approach, this more bourgeois approach, this more elite approach to feminism was already starting to happen in the second wave itself. These feminists, some of them were academics, some of them became academics during the second wave itself, and that slowly started to shift the center of gravity from those who experience the most hardship to those who who have, more of an ability to put their words out there, to set the terms of the conversation, to define the movement, or at least define how the movement is seen and how it will be remembered. One thing I want to emphasize at this point, I do not believe Judith Butler destroyed the happy marriage between queerness and feminism.
Yeah, if anything,
In fact, I do think,
sorry, if anything,
yeah, I
Judith
think
Butler brought
they
some
were
things
one of the
back.
least blameless. Yeah, I think they were one of the least blameless people in that
Yeah.
The
whole
most
shindig.
blameless?
I think that they have very. We shouldn't blame them, okay?
You made it.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Because the shift I'm talking about from like feminism as more of an activist movement to a more academic movement, that happened with the queer movement as well.
Yeah.
And it's not super coincidental that that is why the focus of, gay civil rights centered so heavily on marriage, right? Because queer theory and trans studies as an emergent field, if you're going to have academics, even academics whose departments and funding are less than others, even academics who are part of a very new and nascent and marginalized field, they still have to have a certain degree of privilege in order to be able to do that work at all. And, it can be easy to like dismiss them as white and out of touch, and I do all the time. Don't you worry. But like you do have to kind of like make some amount of peace with the fact that like sometimes the people whose words are most accessible are not going to be the people on the front lines, and you kind of always have to be negotiating with that. But when both feminism and queerness got academized in this way and became less and less about the struggles of the most marginalized, despite the best efforts of intersectional feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Collins, that is how you get a feminist movement that really does not have a firm grounding in all of these struggles that would have that were almost axiomatic to the feminist movement. I'm overstating things a bit. The idea that like the lesbian feminists came in and captured the second wave without no resistance, incredibly simple, and it was very embittered and embattled for almost the entire period. And a lot of the reaction to the second wave was, in fact, just plain lesbophobia, just as a reclamation of the heterosexual feminist revulsion to the idea that you actually have to hold men accountable, or you actually have to transform gender relations in a meaningful way in order to achieve feminist goals. The lesbian feminists, presented that truth to the wider feminist movement, and no one has ever forgiven them for it. But because of that, because of all these forces, because of this shift, because of this, increasingly bourgeois character of both queer studies and feminism and the wider canon on, what are considered feminist and queer works, you are able to very easily just cast fucking anything you want as feminism, right?
Yeah.
Which is really what happened in the UK. You have these like middle class white out of touch straight women who have this interesting relationship to feminism, because feminism, to a certain degree, for a lot of its existence and history, has always been what the most privileged women are concerned with, the thing that bothers them the most. There's the stuff that like Betty Friedan talked about all the way back in the 60s. There is the drudgery of housework. There is the neglect, the disproportionate labor share and the neglect of their husbands. But the problems arise when that is considered to be the sum total of the feminist imagination, which happens surprisingly often. And what that ends up meaning is that you have all these women who can maybe accurately, maybe not to be described as feminists, who still have very reactionary, very bourgeois
Yeah.
politics, who don't really like question their place in society any more than they have to. They don't like the fact that they're disadvantaged because they're women. They're very angry about the fact that they are saddled with things that men are not saddled with. But they don't think very much about the lesbians and the queers and, God forbid, the trannies. Those disgusting trannies who will never understand the pain of womanhood because we don't have wombs. And that's how a reactionary bourgeois and incredibly nationalist, incredibly white movement becomes feminism, roughly concurrently with the trans tipping point, right?
Yeah, and
Like, this always existed, stretching all the way back to the second wave, but this is where it really metastasizes.
yeah, earlier, like way back, you mentioned Me Too, and
Mhm.
I was thinking about this a few weeks back. I was thinking about how Me Too movement happens. This was 2018. So 2018 was like when the Me Too movement really started, and that's also when ROGD was coined. And then, like I mentioned earlier, 2019 was kind of like the peak of trans stuff. So I don't think that's a coinky dink. Like you were already kind of starting to see the groundwork be laid. And like with Me
Mhm.
Too, the connection I was making, I was thinking about the whole Epstein files thing and how trans women are talked about in like the emails, how the first like Epstein person to kind of like blow the
Mhm.
whistle, like Epstein person, say like victim was a trans woman, and everyone like made fun of her for it.
Uh-huh.
But I was thinking it was interesting. You had this big, Me Too movement, this backlash, and the Epstein files come out, and then you have people who were called out by the Me Too movement who are now making like propaganda for the current anti-trans, anti-woman administration, and how trans women are
Mm.
also being portrayed as sexual predators when, like in the Epstein files, they're quite like it's very clear they're sexual victims and under Epstein and co. And I don't think that's a quinky dink, right? It's like you have male
Mhm.
violence being made public, and all of a sudden now we're very, very preoccupied with trans women as sexual predators who we need to protect the women from. And women are like, yes, I'm signing on board because I'm also scared of being sexually assaulted. But it's like, my sister in Christ, your husband's the one who's going to do that to you, like most likely. Meanwhile, trans men are now being portrayed as little girls. And, like it's been a talking point for a while about, especially gay trans men. It's like we were just sexually victimized, and so we're trying to like live out our
Mhm.
our male oppressor or whatever to protect ourselves. But now like that rhetoric's also really escalating, and then you have the kind of politics I was writing about in my recent essay where it's like trans men are like, I've been sexually victimized, and trans women can't understand what it's like because I'm ontologically female and they're not. It's like
Mhm.
it's just all it's one big shit pile, It's like it all just kind of feeds into each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah, and I think that tells me that like so we've mentioned RGD a few times, and I think that's sort of the perfect note to actually let's actually talk about it. Okay, so RGD stands for rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's a discredited theory, and it's like I'm not even being snarky. It is like legitimately
Mhm.
discredited. It was a theory put forth in a paper, and that paper has been retracted, redacted, not sure what word I should be using. But like I remember the results of the paper were announced with a press conference, and it only took a couple of months for like Brown University and like whoever published it to be like, oh shit, this is nothing.
Mhm.
Because what the paper was it was a set of interviews with the parents of trans children, and those interviews were conducted on a very explicitly transphobic forum. So not exactly cutting edge medical science.
It took 7 months, I just checked.
Rapid onset gender dysphoria is basically the concept that, like, oh, we used to have these rare transsexuals that were mostly male to female, but now we're seeing a surge of female to male transsexuals that come in uh, without the telltale signs of transsexualism, quote unquote, meaning manifesting early in childhood, blah, 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 and basically posited this theory that teenage girls are being driven crazy by the internet. That's kind of it.
So it's like half social contagion and half like so when you look at this narrative, you see that like the trans population is being kind of cleaved neatly into two,
Mhm.
right? There are those who cannot be victims, and those who have an easy access to a kind of classical victimhood because they can be very easily cast as patriarchal property on account of reproductive anatomy. And the narrative here is that those who are born to be patriarchal property because of their reproductive anatomy do not have the right to transition. And if they get it into their pretty little heads that they want to transition, why it has to be social contagion, this nebulously defined term that is halfway between peer pressure and being groomed by those evil, evil trannies who are sex pervert rapist men.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence that the majority of people about whom rapid onset dysphoria theory talks about are, and
Mhm.
this is explicit, middle class white American children. Or often, actually, they're talking about
Mhm.
young adults post factum, but
And the
middle class white American children. I've read Schreier for this podcast, and we've done an episode on it. If you want to tune into that, go ahead. I think it's a fun episode, sort of. But there are mentions of people of color. I think exactly
Mhm.
two or one in this book. I can remember off the top of my head one. There might have been
The
another.
Indian one, right?
Yes, they were all upper middle class, and specifically, they make a point of it that this is not a coincidence. They explicitly acknowledge it, that basically, more or less, middle class girls have too much free time with too much social media and not enough banging behind Denny's. No, this is not an exaggeration. And that gives them all the funny ideas and insecurities. In a way, that's Schreier doesn't say this specific bit, but that's a pretty common way transphobia manifests towards people who were assigned people at birth, in a way that would not happen if they were working class or poor or from people with quote unquote real problems. Because a feature of misogyny is women be hysterical, women made it all up, right? And it manifests in regards to people who want to transition to male in the sense of like, or, take on those kinds of HRT or sex changing measures. It results in you made this shit up, basically. And that's all Rogd is.
It's a really strong regendering impulse. It's short.
I've called myself this online too. I kind of tongue-in-cheek call myself ex-ROGD teen or whatever, because like I technically meet, like I was identifying as trans before ROGD came out as a term, but like I grew up like lower middle class, white kid, oldest daughter, in a really conservative Christian family that was abusive. And so like I first experienced gender dysphoria when I was like 4. I had one of my stories is, I was 4 years old. I was at a daycare and I got asked if I was a girly girl or a tomboy. I said neither twice. They asked me, well, like, aren't you a girl at all? And I said, I don't know. And then they beat me up. Right. So it's like I have experienced gender dysphoria at a young age. And then that happened. And I was like, oh, I can't say that out loud because then people will beat me up. And so it's like I stayed closeted until I was 22 years old. That's when I finally came out to my and then I started transitioning like shortly after. So I'm sure I looked very ROGD teen because, I was like on Tumblr a lot as a kid because I wasn't allowed to leave the house. And that was the only place I really had like friends I could talk to. And so, yeah. And so because of all that, I've been concerned with like, a lot of the rhetoric around the little girls are going to mutilate themselves. Like I thought it was really weird that like the Trump admin, passed executive order that has this whole section about how sad it is that these kids are going to grow up one day and not be able to have babies and breastfeed them. And I'm like, why are you thinking like this? Like, why is the sexuality of like 14-year-olds occurring to you like this? Like this is very weird. Like not like, how can I help them as a human being? Just like, oh man, I won't be able to fuck these people one day and have babies with them.
Or let's talk about how like that one Trump executive order was called like keeping men out of women's sports, but like a lot of the online energy that you get, and this is anecdotal, but like I have found it encounter a surprising number of cis people who are just like, well, I support trans people in theory, but also like the idea of like my little Kaylin, having her feet broken by some massive hulking football playing lab of muscle just because he calls himself a girl. I don't like that.
Yeah, it's like, well, that's never happened, so you don't have to worry about it because that's never happened before.
Yeah, it's rather paradoxical, like, because when it comes to gender-based violence, like in schools and stuff like that, segregated spaces do not really prevent it
No.
from happening in particular. You can make the case that they can provide a degree of the feeling of safety, but practically speaking, there is still a lot of gender-based violence in schools. A lot of it encouraged by society, parents, and teachers.
Yes.
And it doesn't really make a difference whether trans people are allowed to go in which toilet, because you're not spending all of your school day on the toilet.
But that would require acknowledging things people don't want to acknowledge.
Yeah.
I think this is what I was trying to get at with my male violence thing I wrote about recently too. It's like, people get so kind of precious about the idea of their little Kaylin, having her foot broken by a big mean trans girl. But it's like, I have worked in schools before. Firstly, girls love to beat each other up, okay? Like girls are crazy in that way. And I say that with all of my heart. Like, oh my God, girls be beating each other up. But also, like, and I've realized this since I transitioned and I've, been with my partner who's a cis queer man. And it's like men experience a lot of violence, and we just like normalize it so much that it's like, when I'm thinking about recently, there's that one guy who was trying to do a gotcha to like women, so that sucks. But he talked about like being sexually assaulted basically, and he's like, "Well, is that sexual assault?" And I was like, "Yeah, if someone's putting their genitals on your face, that is sexual assault." But then everyone immediately was like making fun of him and acting like it happened a lot, and it's like we're just so divorced from the actuality of like the conversation about like violence in schools or violence
Mhm.
wherever, right? It's like this theoretical idea of the hulking trans woman violating the poor little girl and not like, like an older girl beating up a younger girl for being a little bit too dykey, or, like boys getting attacked for being too sissy, or, like boys attacking girls. Like in my
Mhm.
experience, when I was a little girl, I wasn't trans at this point. I didn't identify as trans, but like I got beat up by boys on a playground once, like that was outside of recess. There was teachers around. Nobody intervened. No one intervened. It's like, yeah, it wasn't the bathrooms where I was in danger. It was the fucking playground, but no one talks about that.
And okay, so honestly, this is one of the like biggest successes of the anti-trans movement's PR, right? So if the trans tipping point started off with Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine for playing the role of a
I
trans
see where you're
woman in a
going with
women's
this.
prison, the biggest success of the anti-trans move of the anti successfully denying and burying the idea that trans women can be victimized, that trans women are victimized, that trans women experience a great degree of sexual and gendered violence because most of their propaganda is propped up on this very primal, very cosmetic idea of us as these big hulking men who are putting on dresses to gain access to women in spaces where they are quote unquote supposed to be safe.
But no, but
And in order to do that, you really have to bury just how much trans women have it rough, right?
we start off with this image of Laverne
Mhm.
Cox playing a black trans woman in a women's prison. But now we have ended with quite literally centering upper middle class white women like Chloe Cole, right? So
Mhm.
it's like we've done it, right? They're gone. Now we're centering like the more bourgeois, the white, the respectable, and we're doing this as a way to push back against trans people. And it's like originally we weren't even like really that focused on like the reality of black trans women anyway. It's like we have
Mhm.
someone representing the experience of many of them like on TV, but probably not even in like the most realistic way because it's TV.
Mhm.
But now it's like you have your Chloe Coles. You also have kind of like the whole Jesse Singal like 2018 article where they used that image of that 22-year-old trans man and like outed him, but they tried to pretend like he was this 13-year-old girl who wants a transition, like that again, that was also 2018 when ROGD was happening, when Me Too was happening. Like, of
Mhm.
course, this is all the year before the peak of trans rights in the US, basically. Um,
So many coincidences, right?
the dots they're connecting.
I have to underscore, like, as you said before, this is particularly a focus on, like, these white girls that are meant to produce children for the nation will be unable to do so if they do these things, right? So what essentially happened with Rugged is a moral panic about the loss of the nation's broodmares
Yes.
masquerading as concern for women. And because on the left largely lacked a meaningful concern for women, lacked feminism, there was no
Mhm.
momentum to meet it. What do you do if you have concerns about women in the sense of like you care for women and their struggle and you don't really understand these things and you have option one and that's it, basically.
Yeah, I'm glad y'all are saying this stuff because I get yelled at when I do. Like, this is how like relatively well-meaning people can be sucked into an anti-trans radicalization pipeline because like fundamentally it is easier to, sign up for the tranny panopticon and rage at all these like perverse men invading women's spaces than it is to tell your husband to fucking pull his damn weight and actually watch the baby once in a
Right.
while. You know?
Yeah, and like to be clear, I'm not saying that like people that go on to write terrible anti-feminist, anti-trans legislation, people that go on to commit hate crimes or stalk and harass trans women online, that the way that these people are, that trans people or the queers or are to blame for the way that these people are. That's not true. And the willingness to actively do harm unto others is quite a different thing. You can believe conservative talking points, but not everyone actually takes this to its logical conclusion, right?
Mhm.
However, what I do mean when I say there was no momentum to meet it is that it undoubtedly encouraged people to do their worst.
Yeah, because what was there to meet this moment of like coordinated, concerted, reactionary efforts to completely undo the smidge of positive momentum that like the cultural idea of trans people was experiencing. You have a rudderless feminism that views trans issues as a matter of free expression and free speech. Just let these freaks and queers get their freak on and perform for us at drag brunch. That's trans rights, right?
Right.
You have a queer canon that has increasingly academized itself and has strenuously disavowed its own connection to feminism and the wider struggle against patriarchy. And amidst this all, you have this incredible, incredible amount of epistemic injustice, this complete and total lockout of trans people and trans women in particular from the processes of knowledge making. And, there were trans journalists. Caitlin Burns got like a following and, a platform on the trans sports beat. It's not that there weren't people pushing back, it's just that they were drowned out. And, like, I'm absolutely blaming the right wingers who, poured untold amounts of money and, like, tapped on the reactionary impulses of influential people in order to gather their momentum. But, like, you can't exactly not blame the people who are just like refuse to examine their
Yeah.
own biases, who will be like, okay, tranny, I'll tolerate you, I'll be nice to you as long as you sit over there, but we're not the same. We don't have the same struggle. If you imply you're anything like me, you'll find out just how trans supportive I really am.
I mean, this is
That's a big part of the issue.
like, I guess, what's kind of underscoring in the U.S. like the arguments we were having with people who want like Gavin Newsom to be the next Democratic presidential candidate. It's like, and this is the problem. When I talk about the failures of liberalism and like trans rights, like this is what I'm talking about. Because even though a lot of like liberals in the U.S. like support trans people in the sense that they like wouldn't push back if trans rights were like expanded, like, okay, yeah, they exist, but they're not really that interested or dedicated in actually fighting for actual rights. So, when Gavin Newsom is like, yeah, we are talking too much about like pronouns and we are talking too much about like the trannies, and then we trans people are like, this sucks, like we're being attacked right now. We really need you to be like more like concerted in your effort to protect trans people. And then the libs are like, oh, you can't, you're never satisfied, you're ruining this country, you're going to do like Trump 3.0 because you don't want to support our candidate. It's like, oh my god, can you be serious? Like, have never been serious, and because you're never serious, like, one of the reasons, let me go back to my anti-trans tipping point thing. One of the reasons
Mhm.
why it's been so easy to rescind trans rights is because a lot of the trans rights that were implemented to begin with were not codified. They were executive orders, they were court rulings, they were agency policies.
Mhm.
Whereas almost every single anti-trans policy in the country is codified, almost all of them. So it's going to be way harder to undo a lot of the damage that's been done. Like stuff that's never been codified before is suddenly not codified. And it's going to be way harder to undo all that. And then you have the stupid libs who are like sitting on their hands like, oh, we tried to include you. You can't be mad at us. Like, how dare you be mad at us? I'm like, do more. Do more. You're so unserious. You don't take anything seriously. You're just like, let people do whatever they want. Like, we're not going to codify like Roe v. Wade. Oops, gone now. Well, we couldn't do it because Republicans wouldn't let us do it. It's like, fight more, fight harder, like be serious, and maybe people would actually join you if they saw you were serious about things, but they just aren't.
Lead the conversation perhaps, but this runs into the issue that like there are people who would rather appear as though they are supportive of trans rights, but not really willing to put their back into it, let's say. And that unfortunately brings us to today, right? The darkest hour and all that jazz. Where has this utterly rudderless, this climate of low information, co-opted feminism bent once more towards reactionary ends? This divorce between queerness and feminism. Where has it all brought us in the grand year of 2026? Well, it has brought us 1 year after 2025, where a surprising amount of anti-trans shit went down, including a UK Supreme Court decision that effectively effectively third sexes trans people. Yep, we're going there to my other favorite topic.
If you're not familiar with it, I think if you are even a little bit, this is pretty common knowledge. But basically, at a certain point, the EU court ordered the UK, after a court ruling, to recognize trans people legally as the sex they transition to, because it has ruled that no person should be placed in the legal limbo of being neither male nor female, due to the legal ramification that that position would have. And the UK court said, nah, trans women can't enter women's spaces because too male. Trans men, up to your discretion. If they look too male, they can't either. Is biological sex a sex assigned at birth or sex that you get when you take hormones? It's common sense, people.
Some of the legal scholars that we're friends with are taking the explicit approach that, like, shoving trans people back into a state of legal limbo and all but effectively third sexing us is a violation of our human rights. Hopefully that goes well. UK law is incredibly unserious right now,
touch
at
bases,
least.
unfortunately.
Yep. And God, I don't remember, but like, was the UK Supreme Court decision cited in like Trump's HHS report on trans healthcare? I'm not 100% sure it was, but like the HHS report that came out in 2025 recycled so many of the greatest fucking hits. You're talking ROGD, and it's but what it really especially really leaned on was the idea that actually transition doesn't really do as much for trans people as we say it do. Actually, even after we get access to transition, we're still miserable and have like poor outcomes. So why should we get to transition at all? That was kind of the crux of the HHS report, and whew, that is a doozy.
Yeah, and like, unfortunately, it has had something of a global spread. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, bringing it back at the end, that these things have knock-on effects in the way that they don't, because the cultural export of the West is much larger.
Yeah.
You're simply not going to hear a lot of the times about things that happen in the countries of the global south, for example. It's not everywhere the same, but, often transphobic movements collaborate with each other and are backed by powerful people. So, for example, in my home of Ukraine, currently, they're pushing for legislation that, among other things, well, one, it ends no-fault divorce, but of interest to trans people is that it makes it possible to invalidate marriage to any person who has ever transitioned, if this passes into law. Basically, it doesn't automatically annul all marriages with all trans people, but if anyone, like your family, your jilted boyfriend, whatever, brings to the registry stuff like, look, one of the people in this marriage has transitioned, they have cause to annul the marriage, basically. It's a rollback on an earlier law that existed within my country that automatically annulled marriages when you transitioned. This was motivated by the fact that same-sex marriage is not legal. If you were in a marriage before you transitioned, you were now in a same-sex marriage, not allowed, you're divorced now. That was rolled back, and for a little hot second, the only way to get same-sex married in Ukraine was to transition, basically. So this is, in part, a form of backlash. A much stricter law that has never existed to this point in Eastern Europe, except for Russia. It banned transition earlier. Essentially, a law that is way stricter than anything that has ever existed, that says basically that trans people have no right to marry, in not as many words.
And, I like you mentioning that it's like stricter than any law that's existed before, really, because that's what's also happening in the US. Like, I don't think people know this, but when I was looking at the anti-trans tipping point and all that, like, up until extremely recently, basically, like, all policies about trans people either just, like, didn't exist. It was, like, up to the court's discretion, or, like, there was a few things like California and states like that had some laws in place. But for the most part, like in Kansas, for instance, if you wanted to change, like, your gender marker, there wasn't really a rule about it. It was just kind of like, sometimes the DMV will let you do that. Sometimes they won't. Just kind of depends, like, which judge you're talking to or which person you're talking to. But then, kind of coinciding with the movement, the general kind of trans movement, in 2019, we were suddenly allowed to change our gender markers again. Basically, we got banned in like 11-ish, right? 2019, we were able to like change it again. And then 2023, we got banned again, and it was a whole like court case, and then it ended with us being able to do it again. And then they passed the law banning it again, and this is the first law in the entire country that has banned gender marker changes on driver's licenses. No state has ever legally banned it before. It's now officially banned. Kansas started that. It's like they keep passing new laws that are worse than anything before it.
Yeah, it's very clearly a backlash to trans visibility because prior to that, the law and policy did not accommodate for trans people. But essentially, if you change sex, oftentimes, I'm somewhat oversimplifying the struggle of it, but more or less, institutions would not know how to treat you, but then look at you and be like, okay, you look like a woman/man now, so I guess that's what's happening. I oversimplify. Obviously, it was a dangerous time to live, but a lot of trans people got by on that.
Right.
And now that has been made explicit that trans people exist, they live like this, they need these things. The backlash is to explicitly ban them. And to bring up my personal bugbear, I have talked about in the essays in the past how trying to demythologize the way detransition is talked about, that detrans people, contrary to what right-wing spokespeople would have you believe, are not actually accommodated by right-wing movements and anti-trans propaganda, because a linchpin of patriarchy is that you can't change sex. You can't change it a second time either. What is made explicit in some of these laws, such as the law that, again, this is more or less its phrasing, that all marriages with anyone that has ever transitioned are not valid, is that it does not make exemptions for people that go back. It doesn't matter. It's not, we can take you back. That's not what they mean. There are obviously cases where, such as the automatic gender marker rollback, that can accidentally benefit, quote unquote, detrans people, in the same way that living in a rural area can benefit you, quote unquote, as a trans person that's been on hormones for years, because people don't know what trans people are.
Right.
But in the same vein, in that hypothetical example, it would also be dangerous for your transness to be discovered for whatever reason, because trans people don't know what trans people are. And, in the same vein, any silver linings have to be taken with a great grain of salt. And in this case, the salt is nuclear, it's uranium. Please, everyone, run.
Which I think brings us to a little story from my own gender expansive queer utopian homeland, the nation of India, currently laboring under a theocratic fascist government. But let's ignore that for a moment, shall we? So, I will say that a lot of people in the West, unless they are specifically people who seek out and engage with my writing for whatever reason, know a lot about what it's like to be queer in India. But there are some ideas, right? Occasionally you will see an article in some kind of online publication or zine, or even in Pink News, talking about the Hijra and talking about societies with third genders, with institutional third genders, where these trans and non-binary people are venerated and fulfill some kind of important cultural, social, spiritual role. And then on occasion, reality will intrude, but usually not all the way, because there was the 2014 NALSA legal opinion that sort of tried to enshrine the right of trans and Hijra people, spoken of usually as two separate things, of trans and Hijra people to be able to self-identify, to be able to get legal marker changes, and to be able to access the medication and health care that they need. And this was reported in at least a few Western outlets as this big victory for trans rights in India. It was and it wasn't, because the fact of the matter is, in the third world, there's usually a gulf between what is legal and what is allowed. This is true in the West as well. Maybe a bit less than in the third world, more than people think. In third world cultures and countries, it's usually pretty explicit. The 2014 legal opinion may have formally recognized our right to self ID, but then the 2016 law that actually came into effect didn't have that, neither did the 2019 one. And in practice, Indian trans people had to third sex themselves. We had to third sex ourselves. We had to first declare ourselves trans so we could get our gender marker changed to just trans on our documentation. No trans femme, trans masc, no non-binary, just trans. Throw you into the third sex umbrella. And then once you had that, you could start taking steps, usually contingent on how long you were on hormones, what surgeries you were able to access. You could sort of start the process of being able to change your marker again to legally male or legally female, depending on how cooperative your doctor and your local bureaucrats were. which is a far cry from the, self-ID utopia the 2014 bill had promised. But then in 2026, even amidst this entire like fraught legal landscape, a couple of politicians were like, even this is a little too much, you know? And I don't know if any of our listeners have heard of this, but there is now a 2026 amendment to the 2019 bill on trans people that more or less says that actually trans people, those who identify themselves as trans people, don't deserve rights and don't deserve legal protections because you can't have legal protections for something you chose to do to yourself. Like, you mutilated yourself, tranny, go fuck yourself. And that is kind of quite explicit in the language of the bill as well, by the way. Transition is sort of more or less regarded as mutilation. And the only trans people who are seen as deserving of legal protection are a very small slice of so-called like indigenous trans communities, the Hijra, the Aravani, whatever the local names are for our third sex populations. And so you might suddenly think, wow, if you're not the kind of trans person who can formally enroll with the, Hijra kinship and social system, you're pretty much screwed, right? And that might make you think that like this bill is privileging the Hijra, the local third sex populations in some way. Except if you add it in the context of how there are basically no child abuse laws or even very many domestic violence laws in India, and about how the government has been cracking down on Hijra communities and making their ways of life illegal, making it illegal for them to beg. And if you sort of take into account the stigma against Hijra populations and third sex populations in India that very often accuses these transfeminized third sex populations of being child groomers and child kidnappers, then a clear picture starts to emerge. Why are Hijra and trans people so often accused of being child groomers? Well, I mean, if you pay attention to the ROGD episode, you have an idea of the theory behind it, of why patriarchy guards its property jealously. But in India specifically, the cultural stigma largely emerged because parents kick their queer kids out onto the street a lot, especially their trans feminized kids. Those who grow up a little too faggy, those who may or may not be trans women, but are effeminate effeminate gay men. They get kicked out onto the streets, and usually the only way they're able to survive if they can't hack it on their own doing survival sex work is by assimilating and finding some shelter and some modicum of support with third sex Hijra communities. And so, by explicitly saying that transition is mutilation and that a trans person cannot get legal protections if they voluntarily transition, and by really emphasizing this supposedly rampant practice of quote unquote forcible transitions in Indian society, what this amendment is really doing is basically enshrining in law this stigma that brands Hijra and Aravani and the third sex populations of India as child kidnapping mutilators. So, you need a lot of context to actually understand exactly why this bill is good for no one, why it isn't creating a privileged class of trans people. But once you have the context and once you understand just how core patriarchy and transphobia and misogyny is to India and societies like it, you will see exactly how hard we are being screwed. And much like the case with Ukraine and the US, this is an unprecedented law. Legal language in it is, I'm pretty sure, unprecedented, but so is this like really like vicious attitude of just saying, well, you did it to yourself, so you don't deserve rights. And it would be, I think, neglectful of us to think that this is not related in any way to the escalating rhetoric against trans people all across the globe.
Yeah, and I will also point out that to bring in the bit about the disability justice, and I think, Isaac, in your essay, you point out how one of the failures of the trans tipping point is not explicating on the synthesis how trans healthcare is irrevocably connected to everyone else's healthcare and how, anti-trans laws naturally to anti-abortion laws in this particular instance, where an Indian law essentially says if you do something to yourself, you cannot get legal protection on the basis of it. Does that make it then possible to argue that if you sustain a workplace accident and become disabled, you do not deserve legal protections on it because this is the kind of accident that you would expect to have, or sign like a document that says you understand the risk of this job. If you have stated legally before that you understand the risks of this thing, this job, this activity, and then you get injured in it, does that mean you deserve no legal protection for your acquired disability? Because you have kind of done it to yourself in that framing.
And honestly, looking back at all this stuff, the most frustrating thing about this is just that, like, I still see people saying things like, oh, like you were saying earlier, Isaac, about the liberals, about the, Gavin Newsom's shooters, about how, like, put aside your petty little personal political, pet projects and focus on the real threat. When the real threat has used anti-trans rhetoric and, the organization of reactionary voters and people and reactionary culture pretty solidly around the trans question. Like, this isn't us doing it. Trans rights and trans issues and trans oppression has been made a central, like, core essential topic of modern politics, largely against our will, and we are still, in 2026, being saddled with people who refuse to recognize its importance, even as it's being screamed at us from every fucking medium and outlet and ad. All right. Yeah, I think that's a first episode, everyone. That is a look back on, oh boy, how many ever. So a quick look back on the
10
past.
years.
I think we're maybe
11.
longer than that. The past 3 decades of, like, epistemic neglect in feminism, in this, in that, in activism, in liberalism, and us asking, hey, is it important enough now? All right.
All right. On that note, I think the next episode will be slightly more lighthearted, but it's kind of difficult in the present moments to talk about the failures of the third wave while living in its wreckage. So
yeah, I think for the next episode, unless I'm mistaken, I will be reading that book I have avoided reading all this time.
Yeah, stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Cracked Ivory is supported by Patreon. Join us at patreon.com/crackedivorypod to receive early access to our episodes, as well as full Patreon exclusive episodes and behind-the-scenes content. Follow Talia Bad at taliabad.com and Emma Zaharuk at dolphindiaries.card.co for their solo feminist projects. Cracked Ivory is edited by Emma Zaharuk and produced by Talia Bad and Emma Zaharuk. All music is by Kevin MacLeod. Special thanks to White Mirror, Lava Monster, Axan.dev, Ceiling Fan, Yana Dunfield, Candy Barber, and Nix Taylor. Thanks for listening.